Okay, so have you ever wondered if we can actually predict future violence? I mean, it sounds totally like science fiction, right? But predicting human behavior isn't some futuristic movie plot. It's a very real, high stakes task that forensic clinicians, psychiatrists, and parole boards have to face every single day. And their decisions, well, they directly impact public safety, individual liberty, and honestly, the communities we all live in.
But here's the thing. For a really long time, the scientific consensus on this was pretty bleak. Back in 1981, researcher John Monahan hit the nail on the head with a hard truth. Predicting violent behavior is just incredibly difficult. In fact, if you look back at the 1960s and 70s, a lot of prominent voices argued that mental health workers shouldn't even be considered experts at assessing the risk of future violence. They thought it was essentially just guesswork. So, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to explore exactly how clinical science evolved from that mid-century guesswork into the highly structured, genuinely evidence-based tools that professionals use today. We're going to unpack the anatomy of prediction and see how experts actually evaluate the potential for danger.
Here's a quick roadmap for how we'll break this down. First, we'll look at the prediction problem itself. Then, we'll dive into the HCR20 framework, explore static versus dynamic factors, discuss assessing sexual reoffense risk, and finally, wrap up with structuring the final judgment. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the prediction problem, navigating the unknown.
So why is this so hard? Well, predicting violence is definitely not a simple mathematical equation. For starters, mental illness alone is not a direct, strongly correlated cause of violence. It's just not that simple. On top of that, whether someone becomes violent heavily depends on environmental and situational factors, things like sudden acute stress or losing a personal support system. Those are totally outside a clinician's control. Plus, if an evaluator is just relying on a casual, unstructured chat, their own personal and professional biases can so easily creep in. It's kind of like a pilot trying to fly a commercial jet without a pre-flight checklist. It's inherently dangerous and highly prone to human error.
Moving right along to Section 2, the HCR20 framework, which gives us a structured solution. To actually solve this massive prediction problem, clinicians realized they had to replace all that unstructured guesswork with rigorous clinical tools. Enter the HCR20 version 2. Now, to be clear, this isn't some quick personality quiz you'd find online. It is a highly robust, evidence-based toolkit. It was specifically developed to take an overwhelming amount of complex research data and distill it down into a systematic, manageable checklist that mental health professionals can rely on in psychiatric and correctional settings all over the world. And the way it works is actually brilliant. The HCR20 is built on a triad structure, checking exactly 20 distinct items. First, it looks at 10 historical factors, anchored firmly in the past, things like previous violence or a history of substance use. Then, evaluates 5 clinical factors assessing the person's present state, such as impulsivity or active symptoms of major mental illness. And finally, it looks forward at 5 risk management factors regarding their future environment, like exposure to destabilizers or a lack of personal support. This 3-pronged approach ensures that absolutely no blind spots are left unchecked. That brings us to Section 3, static versus dynamic factors, or the written past versus the manageable future. Now, if you take away one key concept for modern risk assessment, it should be the crucial difference between these two types of risk. First, we have static factors. These are entirely unchangeable. You simply can't rewrite history, right? If someone committed an act of violence at a young age, that fact is locked in as a historical anchor. But then we have dynamic factors. These are the things that fluctuate over time. Active mental illness symptoms, current substance use, a lack of insight. These are absolutely vital to identify because clinical treatment and intervention can actually target and improve them. They give us something to work with. Okay, so how do clinicians actually score these things in the real world? Spoiler alert, they don't just go with their gut. After exhaustively reviewing full files and conducting in-depth interviews, they apply a very strict 3-point scale to every single item. A 0 means the risk factor is definitively absent. A 1 means it's possibly present, or maybe present to a limited extent. And a 2 means the concrete evidence proves it is absolutely present. This rigid structure forces the clinician to rely entirely on cross-checked facts, completely killing any room for vague, unstructured feelings. But here is the kicker. Once all those items are carefully coded, the clinician doesn't just blindly tally up the numbers, run a calculator, and spit out a neat little percentage. It doesn't work like that. Instead, those scores inform a highly structured summary. The assessor takes all that rich context, the past history, the present clinical state, the future environmental risks, and uses their professional judgment to categorize the overall risk for violence into one of three buckets: low, moderate, or high. Let's pivot a bit for Section 4, assessing sexual reoffense risk using a tool called the Static 99R. When professionals have to evaluate a highly specific and incredibly sensitive risk, like sexual reoffending, they turn to specialized tools like the Static 99R. This is an instrument based entirely on statistically weighted static risk factors. In fact, in places like California, using this tool is actually required by law before an eligible sex offender can be released. Why is it mandatory? Because extensive, rigorous validation studies have proven over and over again that this statistical tool is far more accurate at predicting a reoffense than any human mental health professional who is just relying on an interview and a file review. Now I want to share a data point that almost always surprises people. When we look at absolute recidivism rates, the actual sexual reoffense rate for a typical sex offender is somewhere between 4 and 12% after 5 years from their release. Having validated base rates like this is absolutely vital for clinicians. It allows evaluators to anchor their assessments in cold, hard statistical reality, rather than being swayed by the public's, and sometimes their own, exaggerated fear-based perceptions of risk. But wait, we can actually push that predictive accuracy even further. Just like we saw with the HCR20 balancing the past and the present, recent research shows that you get the absolute best results when you combine those unchangeable scores from the Static 99R with dynamic changeable assessments, using companion tools like the LSCMI and Stable. By systematically adding in evaluations of a person's current substance abuse, their self-regulation issues, and deviant interests, clinicians are able to generate a far superior, much more comprehensive picture of someone's overall risk. And that leads us right into our final section, Section 5, structuring the final judgment and managing the future. So, how does all this complex data actually build into a final, actionable report? Well, the golden rule of modern risk assessment is this: predictions absolutely must be probabilistic, not absolute. Clinicians don't have a crystal ball. They literally cannot look at a judge or a parole board and give a simple, guaranteed yes or no on whether someone is going to be violent tomorrow. Instead, they offer probabilistic statements, like saying someone is at a moderate risk, and they anchor that statement to very specific situational circumstances and exact timeframes. Because at the end of the day, this is the ultimate goal of the entire process. It is really not about just slapping a scary label on someone's file. It's about turning that assessment into targeted action. A low-risk judgment might just mean they go into standard supervision, but a moderate or high-risk categorization, that triggers the immediate development of an active, robust management plan. It means directly advising staff, significantly increasing their supervision levels, prioritizing specific treatment resources to target those changeable dynamic factors, and mandating regular reassessments to make sure the public stays safe. We have clearly come a really long way from that clinical pessimism of the 1970s. We don't just guess anymore. We now have the structured, scientific tools to effectively assess behavioral risk. But the real work? That's what comes after the assessment is done. Because ultimately, these complex instruments exist not just to predict a violent future, but to give us the exact roadmap we need to safely change it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. What do you think? Can we ever truly master the human element in these predictions?